Let's talk about context-driven development. This has some similarities to DevOps, and I'll first talk about DevOps before I get back to context-driven development. So DevOps is really describing this process of building things with CI/CD in mind. What is CI/CD? So it's a testing methodology where you're constantly testing your code, you're linting your code, you're effectively improving the quality by pushing it through the build system constantly. And this is a very modern and I would say best practices driven approach to software development. Most companies that are doing modern software development use CI/CD. For companies that are not doing CI/CD, and the D is for deployment or development. And if you're not doing CI/CD, likely there's big problems in your organization because you don't know what's broken. And by constantly pushing the changes into the build system and getting metrics and data and log messages and test output, it gives you that feedback so that you can improve your system, improve the response to customers, improve revenue, etc. That's why there's been so many articles and books about DevOps. I've written, I think, at least 6 books that talk about DevOps myself. So we know that DevOps is a good way to develop software. Most companies that are doing software engineering that are elite companies are doing it. But how does that relate now to context driven development, which is something that has been enabled with these AI assisted development tools? So let me talk about how I feel like there's some similarity there. So the way I develop software for Rust is I will write a bash script that takes all of my Rust artifacts. So the main.rs, the lib.rs, or if I have a bunch of modules, maybe a mod.rs and the whole directory full of files inside. And then I ask the assistant like Claude or DeepSeek, or maybe with a Llama, Quinn, or DeepSeek R1, locally some information about what's happening with my project. I could say, I want you to do a code review of my entire project and look for these certain things. Or I could say, here's my test coverage report. I want you to look at areas that are weak and give me some ideas for writing a test for places that don't have high test coverage. So what I think is interesting about this style is that it has some similarities to DevOps, right? Where with DevOps, the whole point is by putting things into the CI/CD system, you get new information or new ideas. And a lot of those ideas are non-deterministic, right? You don't know, for example, if there's some change that happened that will trigger a test artifact, or in the case of a load test, for example, there's a lot of non-deterministic components to that. You could have monitoring and instrumentation, etc. And by doing the load test, you get to see what breaks. And that's non-deterministic because there are some things that really you can't see until you actually do a load test. So it has some similarities, right, to this AI assisted development where by feeding the context of your project inside, you can get some different ideas or different artifacts to improve the quality of your software. So I think this is where I see a very non-controversial way to use these AI coding assistants. And it's very different than maybe a code completion based approach. Why is it different? Well, with code completion, you're randomly asking, for advice on some function you're building, which doesn't have the context of your entire project. And you're constantly getting this feedback, which may interrupt the expert's flow. But with context driven development, you're not getting feedback on a line or a function level. What you're doing is you're feeding it the entire context of your project and asking very specific questions. And what that does is allows the expert software engineer to decide whether they want to accept that suggestion or not. Just like if the build server fails when you do a deployment and a load test, it doesn't mean you have to change the architecture yet of your project. Maybe you're okay with that. Maybe you're okay with the fact that there's a load test that is failing under certain conditions because you're okay with that level of users that are supported by your application. Likewise, with context-driven development, It's up to you to choose what suggestions you want or what ideas to put inside of your project. So I would say this would be something to explore with these tools, is instead of just blindly taking a co-pilot kind of recommendation, is how can you be explicit and feed the entire context of your project into a tool and then ask very detailed questions. It could be things like unit tests, it could be documentation, it could also be about building a feature. And what you'll find, I think, is that this is potentially a new direction that we can look at with these AI assistant tools. And actually, they work really well with the open tools like the Olama driven tools, just as well as they do with the proprietary systems.